Do you see carryover between the average person and F1 drivers?
A lot of the problems are essentially the same. They're short on time, they're pulled in multiple directions, they're stressed, they don't sleep enough, you don't get stronger in the gym, you get stronger when you sleep.
Dancing came up as the best type of physical activity for mental health.
You see changes on a brain scan, so you can see changes in the structure of the hippocampus, which you know is really critical for memory. The brain is constantly monitoring for mistakes or errors, a mismatch between prediction and reality. In the book I call Retirement the Worst Idea the Brain Ever Encountered, we then start to bring in technologies that require us or allow us to not think. And that's why I think one of the most important things that we can do is go out and really challenge ourselves.
Go out, try stuff, be willing to suck. Welcome to 2%. I'm your host, Michael Easter. So story time. My editor from my books, The Comfort Crisis and Scarcity Brain, his name is Matthew Benjamin. About a year ago, he started hitting me up incessantly about this new book that he was editing. The book is called The Stimulated Mind. It is by Dr. Tommy Wood, who is a neuroscientist. He's a performance coach who has worked with F1 teams, and he is an elite level nerd. So Matthew tells me all these amazing things about this book. I say, all right, send me a copy. I'll read it. I'm skeptical, but I read it, and this book, The Stimulated Mind, is incredible. It has totally changed my thinking and my behavior around what I'm doing right now to be a little bit sharper, but more importantly, how I can stay sharp as I age. So it turns out cognitive decline as you age is not inevitable, but it really depends on what you are doing right now. So we are going to bring on Dr. Tommy Wood to talk to us about how you can increase your mental performance now and keep it for years to come, because I'll tell you this, a mind is a terrible thing to lose. So if we listen to Dr. Tommy Wood, we won't lose it. With all that said, bring it on Tommy right now. All right, Tommy, thanks for joining us, man.
Super excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So it's a really fantastic book. I loved how you brought it all together. There's so much research, but I think what makes the book, what I loved most about it is there's so many books written by scientists who are working in universities, in labs, but the experience is often happening only in the lab. And I think what makes you interesting is you are out in the real world, working with all these different groups, having to apply what you're learning in this free living, crazy environment that is like the human lab of life. How did you start working with different groups? So you've worked with like F1 teams, and what is that like? And how do you think about like marrying those two things?
It's funny because for most of my career, I also saw those as two completely separate things. So I was, first I was trained as a doctor, and then I did my PhD, and I'm doing neuroscience research in the lab. And there's like this group of people in the world who know me as a neuroscientist and doing animal models and mechanism work and all this kind of stuff. And then there's this other group of people who know me as, a coach, and I'm helping them with blood work and nutrition and recovery tactics and stuff. And like even I myself didn't necessarily see that they connected for a long period of time. And it's not the fault of most scientists that they're just kind of like stuck in the lab. It's kind of just how our careers progress.
Totally.
And so my careers progressed much more slowly because I was doing multiple things at the same time. But I do think that we lose a lot as scientists, and often as doctors as well, because we only get this very small snapshot and we never see how this is like being acted out in the real world.
How is the work with sort of in the field? How has it informed your research and what you're doing in the lab?
So most of my work with athletes is in Formula One, working with drivers, but also do some work with other aspects of the teams. And this is part of a big group of people, right? We have doctors, we have coaches, we have psychologists, a variety of different performance experts who come in and out depending on the expertise that we need. And one thing that I've really taken away from that is that the problems that even an elite athlete faces, even though they've eliminated a lot of friction they can eliminate a lot of friction that we might get when we're thinking about behavior change or instituting some kind of new intervention, a lot of the problems are essentially the same. They're short on time, they're pulled in multiple directions, they're stressed, they don't sleep enough. And so then it's much more about how do I figure out the one thing that's most likely to be beneficial? Like, what's the thing that's actually gonna move the needle? So, like the first time I went into Formula One, this is now more than a decade ago, I showed up with like 100 things. I'm like, I'm ready. I've got all the tips. I've got all the papers. Like, I'm just gonna like throw all this stuff at you. And then one of the really kind of experienced coaches who now has sort of taken over a lot of the performance side at this company I work with, Hints at Performance. And he worked with multiple world champions. And he said, we've got time for maybe one thing. Maybe. So like, what's the one thing that we should think about? And so the way that this has kind of influenced my research in the lab is trying to think about how do we figure out what's the most important lever to pull here? How do different and then it's how do different things interact? And this is something that I think we're missing from a lot of research when we're talking about whatever it is. We try and find this one thing, and this is going to be the intervention point. This is where the drug is going to act, or this is the mechanism. This I'm going to tell you to take this supplement, and this is how it's going to act. But in reality, it's this complicated network of things that, right, if you have more of this, then you need less of this, and they kind of offset each other. And so then it's just helping me think about how do you figure out what's going to be the most impactful thing for one person, and often it's just what's the thing they're actually going to do, right? And that's where it comes down to, right, that one thing that you're going to start with. Are they actually going to do it? Then is it going to have an impact?
Do you see carryover between the average person and F1 drivers? Like, what is the thing that you would be giving F1 drivers when it was like the one thing? And is that similar to the average person, what the average person needs?
It depends a little bit on the scenario and where you are kind of in the life course. But there's the kind of the balance between stimulus or training and then recovery and adaptation. So like you don't get stronger in the gym, you get stronger when you sleep and recover afterwards, right? And the brain kind of seems to be the same. And so the average F1 driver gets plenty of stimulus training, driving that car, engineering meetings, right? They're constantly learning, constantly getting better, constantly working on their skills, both in terms of driving, but then, on the engineering and design side as well, because they're sort of involved in that process, because they're the only people who can like give real feedback of how the car is driving. So they don't need more of that. Like they got that covered. Mm-hmm. Then it's much more about how are we getting the most out of what they are doing? How are we making sure they're recovering, so that they can then apply the skills that they're learning or have learned. And I've been sent wearable data by drivers, from sleep, and they're like, I'm worried about the amount of REM sleep that I'm getting. Can you look at my data and like how can we improve that? And you just see they're spending 5 hours in bed. And if you spend 5 hours in bed, you'll get less REM sleep, because REM sleep tends to happen towards the end of the night. And you're like, if you're short on sleep, your body will prioritize deep sleep usually. And that's the same for like so many people, right? The reason why they're not sleeping enough is they're not spending enough time in bed.
Yeah.
So you see these same hurdles popping up again and again. And so like for people, working, doing complex jobs, they're getting plenty of kind of inputs to the brain. People in their 30s, 40s, 50s. But usually what they're not doing enough of, for their brains at least, is actually giving themselves time to switch off, not do anything where they're juggling multiple screens, multiple inputs, email, Slack, Teams, Instagram, and then not giving themselves enough time to kind of properly sleep at night. So that's in that part of the life course. That's what I see most often, and it's very similar between those two groups.
Yeah, not enough sleep, too much time on thinking, being stimulated by all the stuff that comes in. When I was talking to Matthew, our mutual editor, he told me, and you can correct me if he's just making this up, he told me that in your own life, sleep is probably your main priority. Like if it comes down to I could get 5 hours of sleep and I wake up and lift, I'd rather take 7 hours of sleep and maybe forego a workout or two. Is that correct?
At this point in my life, yeah. Life gets too busy or whatever. I can do 5 minutes of something, any kind of movement, and then but get another hour or two of sleep. I know I'll do much better. Yeah, at some point I want to get back in the gym, but when it gets like that, that's kind of my choice. And I think that definitely supports how I function best. In the in the book, I have this idea of the traffic light system that I took from my friend Simon Marshall, who was a behavioral psychologist and worked with a lot of elite athletes, like pro cycling teams and the Tour de France and people like that. The idea is to just kind of separate out your different health supporting behaviors based on what you're going to keep as things get crazy, which they will sometimes. So
Totally.
So like green is what you do all the time, right? You can work out, you can sleep, you can do your meditation if you meditate, all that, you cook your own food, all that kind of stuff. Yellow is when things start to get a bit busy. Like how do you adapt it? So then you might say, well, I'm not going to do a 2-hour workout, but here's what I can do in 30 minutes. Or here are like really easy takeout items or things that I can have in the freezer that I can eat if I can't cook. Like just to prepare for that, because it's going to happen. And then red is like you have to work 18-hour days, or your spouse is sick in the hospital or something like that. And what's like the one thing that you do to kind of keep you anchored? So for me, it'll be like, can I focus on sleep?
Yeah.
And that's important because what happens is when we get busy, we can start to catastrophize. Oh, I can't do all the things that I need to do, and therefore I'm not going to perform well, right? That's going to make us not perform well because we think we won't perform well. Or we just give up entirely. So if you just say, right, this is what happens, these are the things I'm going to do, forget about everything else, I'll come back to them when things settle down again, you're prepared. You know what to do when life starts to throw stuff at you, which it's going to do. And that just makes it that much easier. And you know that you're going to at least have one or two anchors that are going to sort of like keep you grounded as, sleep gets short or stress gets high.
Yeah.
And then the last part, because so much of this does actually come down to psychology. Like the information people have some good idea of, or like what is going to be important for brain health, cognitive function, etc. But I know that I've like built a pretty good set of habits and environments that kind of support my functioning over time. So I know that I'm now more resilient to like things like this, to the red times.
Yeah.
And I've built up capacity that I can draw on when I need to, as long as I then eventually go back and recover from it when time allows.
Yeah, it's like you're putting in time during the green light periods. You're kind of like building yourself going, all right, I know I'm going to hit some yellows, I'm going to hit some reds, but when I do inevitably hit a yellow, I've got a great foundation that like I'm still going to be fine.
Yeah, exactly. And knowing that you'll be fine is part of that key. Is key to that. Because if you think that you won't, then you won't.
Totally. I feel like one of the sort of the big overarching argument of the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we seem to think that cognitive decline is this inevitable thing. Just like you're going to get old, your brain's going to go to shit. That's that. Good luck out there. But you really argue in the book that isn't the case, and it really just sort of depends on what inputs are you giving your brain and how are you thinking about this long term. Is that correct?
As a society, we've embodied this idea of what aging looks like, right? And that is generally tied to some amount of physical and cognitive decline. So we expect it, and therefore, I believe we stop doing the things that could slow it down. It's not going to prevent it entirely, right? We can't stop the aging process. We know that. But we can slow it down. Or more accurately, for many of the things, is we can not do the things that speed it up, which include a low-quality diet, being sedentary, not sleeping well, etc. So it's this kind of expectation, I think, that's driving a lot of it. Because, you might think, oh, I'm too old to do that. I can't learn that new thing. I can't go to the gym. I'll get injured. Whereas those activities, learning new skills, being physically active, will help to maintain function, right? The body is constantly adapting its function to the inputs it's receiving. So the demands you place on your tissues, including your brain, then determine how they function. And we can go back to some really nice studies that were started in the 1950s. So there's one study that I mentioned called the Seattle Longitudinal Study. It was run by Warner Shai out of the University of Washington and started in the 1950s. And it was one of the first studies to look at the same people over decades.
Okay.
Because before then, you might take a big group of people and measure how their brains work. And yeah, you'd see the 70-year-olds didn't perform as well as the 30-year-olds. So then on average, right? And this is all based on averages. But that's very different from saying, how is my brain going to function in 30 years' time?
Yeah.
And so they brought the same people back every 7 years in this study. And what they saw is that the majority, by which I mean more than 50%, of people maintained brain function from their 50s into their 80s. And nowadays, we call those people super agers. Like we have a name for it. That's the scientific definition, is people who maintain the cognitive function of their 50s into their 80s.
Okay.
And what we saw in Warner Shai's work is that cardiovascular risk factors and what they called environmental complexity, which is the nature of your work environment, home environment, your hobbies. These were like some significant determinants of how likely you were to decline over time. And so now, if we look at superager research, what do superagers do? They remain cognitively engaged. They have hobbies. They remain socially engaged. They avoid metabolic disease. They sleep well, and they're physically active. Right? None of that requires superhuman effort, and it shouldn't be unusual. And so we've known this for decades. We're just starting to kind of put those pieces together, and hopefully that will allow people to reframe what it looks like to get older and know that they do have some agency in what that looks like.
This made me think about my mom. She's 77. She retired. Well, here's the thing. So she was planning to totally retire at 75. So she was an independent salesperson for women's clothes, basically. So she had a bunch of lines across her career that she would sell to stores who would then sell it to people who wear the clothes. But she worked a long time into old age. And at 75, she's like, okay, I'm going to retire. And I'm like, great, get rid of it all. You're done. She tells me she retires. And then a couple months later, she's like, well, I'm going to tell you the truth. I kept one line. It's like a low lift line. I was like, oh, come on, Mom. Just let it go. Just kind of do nothing. And then I read your book and I'm like, you know what? Keeping that one line that's not this massive amount of effort, that's not like she's not working, 60 hours a week like she did her entire life, but she's like, 5-10 hours a week. I'm like, actually, that might have been a good thing. So it just made me think about, because you talk about retirement and how it's been framed. So kind of tell us about, the upsides and downsides of retirement and what people, as they sort of think about retiring, or if they are retiring right now, should be thinking about doing.
In the book, I call retirement the worst idea the brain ever encountered. And I go back to the history of retirement, which didn't really get popularized until the beginning of the 20th century. Other societies had like military pensions for those who'd served in the military, but for like the average worker, retirement really wasn't a thing until 100 or so years ago. And what we do see is that by multiple population studies and some like modeling studies done as well using like US data, the period of most rapid cognitive decline seems to be retirement. I don't work with patients anymore, but when I speak to doctors working in that kind of population, people around retirement or recently retired, either as primary care physicians or neurology, geriatrics, that's when they start to see people decline as well. So we sort of see it in the data, and we see it from clinical experience. And it kind of makes sense, because if the brain is functioning based on the inputs we give it, and if your work is the primary place where you get social contact, social interaction, your problem solving, learning, all the sort of like skills that you've developed in your career, you're expressing them, right, which we know is important to maintain function, and you remove that, then you've removed the primary driver of whatever, cognitive, or a large chunk of the cognitive functions that you have. And so there are studies that show that particularly early retirement is associated with an increased risk of dementia after you account for things like medical conditions that might force you to retire early.
Yeah.
So I think this kind of makes sense when we're thinking about the brain constantly matching inputs to function. So then I'm not saying that people like you're welcome to your well-earned retirement if you want it. Like that's I'm not telling you have to work forever if you don't want to. But you have to think about replacing work with similarly engaging or stimulating activities. So do you start to learn a new skill? Do you pick up a new sport? Do you go and volunteer? Do you go and learn a language? Reading, it is an important one. Do you have a collection of skills and hobbies that you can kind of stay engaged with? That's the most important thing. And maybe starting to think about that before actually retirement hits, because you may end up with like a chunk of time where you're just like sitting around wondering what to do. And, already you're sort of like potentially falling behind. So there's kind of this transition period, maybe, where you're thinking about what's going to come next and think about some of the things you might want to do instead.
Yeah, the problem isn't inherently retirement. It's retirement when you go, okay, well, so I'm just going to kind of sit around and do nothing, where really it's like, okay, this is just sort of a new chapter. What new things can I do? What cool things that I've been putting off, whether it's I'm going to learn Spanish, I'm going to take up dancing, I'm going to volunteer, I'm going to just do something that challenges me. Ideally, it has some other people involved, to kind of keep pushing the ball forward and challenging myself.
Yeah, exactly.
So the book is called The Stimulated Mind, and you have some sections where you talk about how much information we're exposed to now. I remember when I was writing Scarcity Brain a few years ago, I came upon this study, and who knows if it's correct, but I think it's sort of directionally correct, that the average person today is exposed to more information than a person in the 1400s may have seen their entire life. Now, again, who knows if that's perfectly correct. At the same time, I think we can say, yeah, it's probably directionally correct. How do you think about like this information sphere that we live in, especially information that comes out as fast, that comes through a screen? How is that affecting our brain and how we age?
So I think I say something very similar in my book. I didn't put a number on it on purpose, because I was like, I have no idea how you quantify these things, but what I write now is probably going to be even worse in 6 months' time when the book actually gets published, right? But I think that's absolutely true. The amount of information plus how we're expected to use information has certainly changed significantly. And there are some really interesting studies that show that how we use and access information has changed as a result. So you might have heard of these classic studies by Betsy Sparrow that resulted in the naming of something called the Google effect, which is that you're less likely to remember the information. You're more likely to remember where that information is stored. And they showed this through a variety of studies. So if people thought that a computer would save a piece of information, they were less likely to remember that information, but more likely to remember where it was stored in the computer. That doesn't mean that our memories aren't working. You're still remembering something. It's just that now we've gotten to a point where there's so much information that we just can't retain all of it. It's much more about like remembering the little tags that allow us to go and find that information. And I don't think that's good or bad. I think that we're going to have to shift how we use our brains to kind of deal with these new technologies. So that's something that we've seen, and that's something that will probably continue. And I'm not so concerned about that because we're still exercising our memory. We're still actually having to remember something in that setting. And I think that's fine. But what you see when we then start to bring in technologies that require us or allow us to not think, that's where I think we're going to start to potentially get into trouble. So
you're talking about a lot of people AI now. Here?
I'm talking about AI. Yeah. So the main kind of idea, if we want to maintain cognitive function long term, is that we have to engage in things that require us to use and build those functions, right? And there are so many different ways to do that. There are so many different ways to use your memory. There are so many different ways to use your decision making and train your brain or maintain processing speed so you can rapidly process information, right? You can do it through dancing or pickleball or video games, right? All of these things are options, but you still need to engage in something that's cognitively demanding and cognitively challenging. So then mindlessly scrolling through stuff on social media does not provide that kind of cognitive, friction or challenge. Again, I don't think it's necessarily bad. You could use it as like a 5-minute kind of break, switch off. Like there is some evidence that that's okay in the setting of a bigger kind of cognitively challenging day. But when that becomes everything, you're not actually building and maintaining these cognitive skills. And then the same thing becomes true with AI. And this is another area where, like, what does it look like in 6 months or 2 years? I genuinely have no idea. But there's a framework that I think is really useful that I've borrowed from a colleague of mine, Ken Ford, who's been an expert in AI for like 30 plus years at this point. And he talks about this idea of cognitive prosthetics versus cognitive orthotics. And an orthotic is something that you use to enhance current capabilities. So when I think of orthotics, I think of shoes for somebody with cerebral palsy. If you have cerebral palsy, all right, motor control is affected. You might not be able to walk normally, but you could put somebody in a shoe or something else that allows them to walk. You've built on their current capabilities, right? You've expanded their capacity. A prosthetic is something that you use instead of something that you don't have, right? So if you have a prosthetic leg, it's because you're missing parts or all of your leg.
Yeah.
And so you can use AI tools to enhance capacity. So it would be if you do some kind of piece of work, and the studies they've done looking at this are like students writing essays. Mm-hmm. You write the essay first. You make the presentation first. You write the blog post first. Like whatever it is, you do what you can with the skills that you have, and then you say to Claude or whichever LLM you like, what have I missed? What could I be thinking of differently? What should I add? What have I got wrong? And then you get that feedback and you incorporate it yourself. So all of this requires you to interact with it and actually apply your brain to that process. And when you do that in the small studies that have been done so far, first of all, the act of doing the work in the first place activates those networks in the brain associated with it. It's more unique because it's like based on your actual work. But then you can improve the final outcome by getting some feedback and sort of interacting with this, outside orthotic. But you could go the other way, which is you use the tool to just do all the work for you. And then it's like you're using it instead of your brain as if you didn't have one. And then you have less activation of the networks in the brain, less skill building. It feels less personal to you. You remember it less well because you didn't actually do the work. So I'm thinking about, can it augment function or is it going to allow skills and functions to atrophy? And you could go either way. And it just depends on how you choose to interact with it.
I saw a tweet from, I believe there was a professor at Stanford, and she was talking about how a few years ago, when she would have these open book written answer questions based on readings, they couldn't reference notes or anything, her students. She said the average was about an 80 in the class on these tests that were, written answers, no notes. In the last couple of years since the rise of AI, nothing has changed about her class. Nothing has changed about how she's taught, but the average has dropped to 60. And she started to think about it. She goes, I think what is happening is that instead of students reading what I've assigned them, what they've effectively done is uploaded the reading into an AI and been, hey, summarize this in like 2 paragraphs because I don't want to read this 20-page paper. So it kicks that out. And then in turn, when it comes down to like, okay, I have to write out this thought-out answer about this, they just don't have the information there. And they're like, oh, I don't remember it. Who knows?
Yeah. So because the open book type exam, right? You kind of think, well, you have access to all this information, but in general, in those types of exams, there is so much information. There isn't enough time in the exam for you to go and actually like look it up and then formulate a theory of it and then kind of put it together, right? Yeah. You might be able to go and look up a single fact or something if you've forgotten exactly what it is. Yeah. But traditionally, what you would do in that kind of setting is you'd get the material, you'd read it, and then you'd write your own notes, kind of summarizing it, right? And then it's actually it's in there, plus your own thoughts and opinions of it, which is probably often what the professor might want. So I think giving the act of summarization even to AI, you miss those steps of actually really thinking about the material and summarizing it in a way that makes sense to you and that you remember it so that you can then apply it in whatever setting it is that you need to apply it. And in like medicine, that's going to be critical. In engineering, that's going to be critical. Like there's a whole range of fields where you have to put in some reps, kind of integrating and understanding the material so that you have it on hand, when it's needed, which often might be in a relatively time pressure situation.
This actually makes me think about my own work. So in my past 2 books, when I've gone out on reporting trips, like whether I was in the Arctic for the Comfort Crisis, whether I was in all the places I went in Scarcity Brain, I would write all my notes in a notebook. Okay. For the book I'm working on now, I did this long hike through southern Utah. So we're hiking all day. I couldn't stop and write notes because I got to hike. And so what I did instead is I would take voice memos. I would just say something as I was hiking. Now, when I went back to those voice memos, yes, I had all the material there, but I wouldn't remember like half of it. I was like, I forgot this happened. Whereas with my past books, because I had been forced to think it out, how am I going to explain this in a quick note? I had to write it out. I would remember all that stuff. And it was just one of those where I'm like, oh, that's an interesting observation.
There are some interesting data on the different brain networks activated during the process of actual like physical writing. And I think that's part of it. There's this inherent set of networks that are activated through that process that may help people to learn, and it may be different. Like it's may be different from person to person, right? In terms of like what works best for you, because we know in other settings. So there's a big set of research on like therapeutic writing as part of sort of psychological therapy kind of thing, and you can get many of the same benefits if you just say it out loud versus writing it down. So it might depend a little bit on the person, but I think you're right that there is some evidence that actual physical act of writing, and this is definitely what I did my entire university career. Like I wouldn't internalize it unless I actually like physically wrote it down. And I think we kind of see some research that would support that. There's something special about writing it down. Yeah,
you mentioned earlier dancing. And you had some awesome information about dancing in the book, which I just loved because that's something that I think, for lack of a better term, fitness bros, like maybe you and I would just be like, dancing, yeah, I'm out of there. But there's a lot of research that says it's actually great for our brains. And there's also, I don't know if you referenced this study, but it's a study I came across that looked at physical activity and depression, how it relates. And it like ranked all these different types of physical activity. And dancing came up as like the best type of physical activity for mental health.
Yeah, so I actually do reference that meta-analysis in the book for that reason. You're right that historically, I would have sort of laughed off at dancing. I do my running, I do my hard training, I do my rowing, I lift my weights. Like I'm doing everything that I need from a physical activity standpoint. But you see again and again in many different scenarios that when you compare two physical activities that have the same level of physical intensity, both are great for cognition and brain health and cardiovascular fitness and all that stuff. But you see an edge in the one that has a coordinative component. So comparing like table tennis or badminton to cycling, or they've done studies comparing dancing to like circuit training. They've done comparing running around a track to running around that same track, but where they've added obstacles that you kind of have to like jump over and climb under. And dancing consistently sort of seems to outcompete all of those. So in that same meta-analysis, in that meta-analysis, it wasn't that they directly compared dancing to all those different interventions, but when they looked at all these different interventions and then said, what's the effect of these interventions on like symptoms of depression? Yeah. The effect size was largest for dancing. And we see the same thing for cognitive function, especially sort of in older adults, all those are already experiencing some level of cognitive decline. In studies where they've looked at it, you see changes on a brain scan, so you can see changes in the structure of the hippocampus, which you know is really critical for memory, and you see changes in cognitive function if you sort of like formally measure them. And I think it's this combination of complex motor skills, music, there's a social component, physical activity component, there's a fun component. And I think all of those things kind of come together. So there's absolutely there's some cardiovascular benefit. It's moderate physical activity probably most of the time. But that like complex coordination piece plus all the other pieces laid on top seem to have this outsized effect.
Yeah. I think one thing that's interesting too is when you look, and I think Daniel Lieberman at Harvard has written a bit about this, when you look at human history and physical activity, no one ever exercised, which is just moving for the sake of it. The only time people would just move for the sake of it without like a clear output of, okay, I need to go get food, I need to get water, we need to go find, I don't know, wood for a fire. The only time people would move for the sake of it was with dancing. And it almost became this like religious, spiritual, social community act. And it seems like all communities have done it throughout time.
Yeah, I think that when you boil down some of the different activities that we know seem to have the biggest effect in terms of building, maintaining cognitive function, they really come down to these like core human activities that I think are like almost baked into our biology in a certain way. So like, yes, just general movement all day is really important, but then languages and music and dancing and like navigation, I know you've written about a lot, right? That's like traditionally been something that we needed to do, and it seems to be really important for our brains. And so if we're trying to think of where to start, those seem to be really like foundational skills that the human brain almost expects as an input. I think that then has these benefits as a result.
How does nutrition factor into brain health, and do supplements play a useful role, or is it all just kind of bunk when it comes to supplements?
So most of it is probably bunk, but there are some supplements that have some evidence for them in specific settings. So the way that I think about nutrition is this confluence of sort of three different levers. The first just being total energy availability, like in the body. And we see that when you're looking at like brain volume, which is an important aspect of long-term cognition, right? You want to have buffer in the systems, like as much volume as possible, essentially, and sort of relative to the size of your skull. You see there's kind of like a bell-shaped curve of energy availability versus brain volume. So at the high end, which is now more typical in a sort of like standard, modernized, westernized society, where you have metabolic disease, prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, obesity, you see faster rates of cognitive decline, higher rates of dementia. But you also see it at the low end. And I think this is definitely relevant to athletes and people chasing longevity who are chronically calorically restricting themselves. And in that setting, and I've seen this in a lot of athletes that I work with, when you have low energy availability, you have poor sleep, poor cognition, mood changes. And that's just because you don't have enough energy to run the system. So that's an important part. And the next part is nutrients. So there are specific nutrients that we know are tied to long-term risk of cognitive decline. Probably the ones with the best evidence are iron, vitamin D, omega-3 fatty acids, and the B vitamins, particularly B vitamins associated with methylation, and if you're insufficient in them, you see an increase in the marker homocysteine. Okay. So that's B12, folate, B6, and riboflavin. And that's where we also have some pretty good evidence for intervention. So several studies historically did things like give people B vitamins to see whether it decreased their risk of dementia long-term, or give omega-3 fatty acids to see whether it decreases the risk of dementia long-term, and with fairly unimpressive results. And so as a result, people were like, oh, they don't work.
Yeah.
Usually in those settings, they weren't looking at like whether the people needed it in the first place. And then they weren't looking at other nutrient markers at the same time. Mm. And so you see that particularly B vitamins and omega-3 fats interact in terms of their effect on the brain. So the first study to find this was the VitaCog study. It was done at the University of Oxford. And they took people with a high level of homocysteine. So that's, you ideally want your homocysteine at least below 13, from a cognitive standpoint, probably below sort of 10 to 11. And they saw people with elevated homocysteine. They gave them a B vitamin, a very basic B vitamin. Mm-hmm. And they saw slowed rates of brain atrophy and slowed rates of cognitive decline. But they found that this effect, the benefit, was only in those who had an adequate omega-3 status.
Interesting.
And there are now at least three randomized controlled trials that have found the same thing. So the B-Proof trial found the same thing, that if you give B vitamins but they don't have adequate omega-3s, you don't see benefit. And the omega-AD trial found the opposite, which was that if you give omega-3s, but they have high homocysteine, they don't benefit. But if you have both, you do benefit. So this kind of makes sense when you think about how these nutrients interact in the brain. And actually, for them to sort of benefit brain membrane structure and function, which is kind of part of what they do, they interact. They require one another. So where I would kind of stand from a supplement standpoint is you can test for some of these things. And it's very easy to test omega-3 status. Your primary care provider should be able to get a homocysteine level. Definitely check your iron. Low iron is often a cause of cognitive changes in perimenopause for women. Vitamin D status, we know if you're vitamin D deficient, you have a higher risk of dementia. And so these are basic things that you can get tested. And if you need to, that we have evidence right from those trials that you can supplement, and you will then see benefit as a result. So that's kind of where I'd focus, is supplements to overcome insufficiencies in the diet. And you see something similar with the Cosmos study, this massive randomized controlled trial that gave people a multivitamin. And so they saw some benefits from that. In those who had a low quality diet, there was benefits from an antioxidant supplement, a cocoa flavanol supplement, just because we know that these polyphenol antioxidants can be important for the brain. So that's really supplements to overcome known deficits in the diet is where I would focus.
That makes sense. To go back to what you said about sort of this balance between overeating and undereating, when you're working, especially with athletes, because I think a lot of people who listen to this, lift, run, do all the things. How do you help people find the balance?
My sort of approach is to eat as much as you can without gaining significant weight.
Yeah.
So that's basically it.
That's just great. It's just kind of track your weight. If you're gaining weight, eat a little less. If you're not, keep on eating. Yeah,
that's exactly it. And hopefully, right. So I mentioned there were 3 levers of diet, right? So there's energy and nutrients, and then the third is pattern. Is what pattern of your diet allows you to sustainably hit those other 2. And that can be any number of different dietary patterns, whether they have names or not. But you hit those 2 things and you do it sustainably, that's what matters. So yeah, in general, I encourage athletes to eat more. That tends to be associated with improvements in performance, as long as they're still maintaining weight goals or body composition goals, which is often important depending on their sport.
So you sign up for this ultra marathon, or no, it was a Ironman.
Yeah.
But it's like a off-road.
It was the world's first fully off-road Ironman.
Yeah. And what did you learn from that? Because for people, if you're not watching this on video, you're not necessarily built like an endurance athlete. You're a big dude, and you got a strongman competition coming up in 10 days. So what did you learn from that, specifically about why it's useful to try things that are totally out of your comfort zone?
When I got my first paycheck as a doctor, the thing that I spent it on was registration for this this race. So this is now 2012, and this is still to date the only triathlon I ever did. Was this 24-hour fully off-road Ironman?
One and done.
One and done. That was it. And what there were definitely several learnings that I took from this, but one was getting to the point where I knew that I just wouldn't quit, right? So it was this idea of exposing myself to all the different pieces so that I knew when I was uncomfortable, when I was lost and I didn't know what I was doing, I would still have some idea of what I needed to do next. And that was because I couldn't do the perfect training program. I was working as a judo doctor, doing night shifts, all that kind of stuff. So I just went out and I saw the course, and I knew I wasn't going to be the fastest guy. I wasn't the best navigator. I wasn't going to be the fittest guy. I was less heavy than I am now, but the goal was just to not quit, right? Yeah. So I just gave myself all these bits of information and tried all these different things so that I knew that when I did fall off my bike, which I did all the time, because the bike was during a torrential rainstorm, the third wettest summer in the UK since records began. So it was just this process of going out and doing things so that I knew that when I sucked or I couldn't do it or I failed or fell over or I got lost, that I could sort of overcome it. And then for that reason, more than 50% of the field quit in this race. It was long, it was wet, but I knew through the process of like just going out there and trying this stuff and figuring it out and getting it wrong, that I knew I could do it. Like that was the main thing going in, is that I wouldn't finish first, but I knew that I could complete it. And kind of broadening that out to this idea of trying things that are difficult and that you suck at, because like, you're right, I'm not an endurance athlete. I'm not built like a runner, certainly, because I was a rower in college. So like a sitting down sport, I'd be okay at, because I don't need to like lug my body weight around. But like building that out sort of broadly into this idea of sucking, that I believe is one of the primary drivers of neuroplasticity in the brain.
Neuroplasticity is, could you quickly define it just for people who don't know?
Yeah, absolutely. So neuroplasticity is just this process of building new connections in the brain. So most of the adult brain doesn't make new neurons, but the whole brain can continuously make new connections. And when you make new connections, then there are a whole bunch of other cells involved. You can improve structure. That's associated with improvements in function. You can see this on MRI scan. Like there are studies where you teach people how to juggle, and the better they get at juggling, you can actually watch their visual cortex change structure on an MRI scan in real time. Super cool. And the way that this happens is the brain is constantly monitoring for mistakes or errors. Or what it's actually monitoring for is a mismatch between prediction and reality. So your brain is a prediction machine. What I am experiencing right now is not happening in real time. It's happening on a slight delay, at least sort of 80 milliseconds or so. That's the amount of time it takes for all the information to go into my eyes and ears and like be processed by the brain so that I can like see it in my mind's eye. And so most of what I experience is a prediction based on this lagged data plus what my brain thinks will happen next. And so when I go to a dance class, for example, right? And I actually have I once was signed up for a dance class and then I didn't go because I was so worried about sucking that I didn't do it. And now I still regret it to this day because I know how good it would have been for me.
There's still time.
Yeah. If you've ever watched True Lies with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jamie Lee Curtis, like in the opening scene, they tango. Right? He like dips it down, like you grab the rose with your mouth, all that kind of stuff. So like when I go and tango for the first time, that's what I'm imagining. But like what's actually going to happen is I'm going to trip over my wife's feet and I'm going to drop her. And that difference between expectation and reality, the brain is constantly monitoring for that. And then when that happens, that starts to divert resources, that starts the process of neuroplasticity to like close that gap. What do I need to do to kind of build the skill to get me closer to what I want to happen to actually happen? And so making mistakes and errors, pushing the boundaries of your current capabilities are what then builds capacity. And it's just like going to failure in the gym or like pushing yourself really hard in a sprint training workout or something like that. You're putting a stressor on the system and you need to give it time to rest and recover and adapt and the nutrient resources to do that and all that kind of stuff. But you need to kind of stress the system so that it builds capacity and response. And that's why I think one of the most important things that we can do is go out and really challenge ourselves. One, it's important psychologically, like it was in my Ironman race. Like I know I can overcome these challenges when I face them. But the other one is that it actually builds functional capacity in the brain.
That feels like the perfect metaphor for your book. Go out, try stuff, be willing to suck, do new things, just keep on moving and living and don't quit.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, man, thanks so much for coming on. The book is The Stimulated Mind. It was fantastic. I think you did a really excellent job weaving in all the research with like just practical takeaways, but also your practical experiences in the field. And I think that is like the mark of a really excellent book because it leaves you with information you can actually use.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. I've been a big fan of your writing for a long time. So like knowing that you're really good at that, those comments mean a lot to me.
Awesome. Thanks again, man.
Thank you.
All right, that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for checking out the show. As a reminder, we are in your feeds twice a week. So do not forget to hit subscribe. If you have any questions for our Ask Michael Anything section, drop them in the comments or send us an email, and we will do our best to answer every single question we can. Bonus, if you want to score those bonus points, send us your question as a voice file or in a video. We would love that. Go ahead and do it. And as always, to close things out, have fun, don't die.